Welcome back to Eric's Hobby Workshop. In this video, we're going to be building a Gothic spaceship window display stand. As the idea for this project grew in my mind, I knew I wanted a window for this diorama to communicate that you're in one of these Imperial ships looking out. I wanted to capture a sense of the intimidating scale and Gothic design while still making it look plausibly like a spaceship interior. So what is Gothic? In the real world, the Goths, no, not those Goths, the original Goths, were a Germanic tribe from antiquity, often treated by history as barbarians who were in large part responsible for the fall of Rome in the ensuing Dark Ages. Centuries later, Gothic became a term to describe the architectural style of the High Middle and Late Middle Ages, characterized by pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and buttresses. This term was coined by later Renaissance scholars as a pejorative to associate this style with unrefined and barbaric people, deliberately contrasting it with the more refined Roman Empire that had preceded this period. So you're probably thinking, okay, fine, sure, cool, good, whatever. What does any of this have to do with Warhammer? And my point is this: I think there's a deliberate parallel here. 40K doesn't take place in a utopian future. It takes place in a regressive, horrible future where superstition and fear has taken the place of reason and progress. So basically what I'm getting at is these Gothic architectural elements are more than just something to look at. They actually have a symbolism that builds the world on a deeper level and sells the dystopian, grimdark nature of this awesome setting. So, now that you know where I'm coming from with my build, let's get to it. I start this project by cutting the base from a 1-inch sheet of pink XPS foam. I measure a 6-inch by 6-inch square, and then I cut it out with my craft knife. I use a very sharp blade and make many passes to get as clean of a cut as I can. If you have a hot wire cutter or something, it would work better for this, but a knife works fine. With that platform cut out, I use a square edge to mark out approximately where I think my walls are going to be. Then, using foam board, I measure out some wall sections and cut them to shape. These are going to form the background of the piece and allow me to create a starry night sky effect. Using some hot glue, I glue the pieces together. Unfortunately, at first I glued the wrong edges together, so I had to rip that apart and glue it again. But that stuff happens, no big deal. And then I glued the pieces, once they were glued properly, onto the base. Using my craft knife, I cut out the portion that's going to be the night sky. This will allow the starry backdrop to extend below the levels the minis are standing on, hopefully giving a better sense of space. Once I've cut through all that glue I just did, I get the piece out with a few taps of my fingers. Pop! Very satisfying. Let's talk about arches for a second. On the left here, we have a standard Roman arch. If you think of the curve of the arch as a circle, then the diameter of the circle is the width of the arch. On the other hand, we have a Gothic arch. In this case, if you think of the curves of the arch as a circle, the radius of the circle is the width of the arch. And there are two different circles centered on the edges of the arch. Maybe I'm not doing a good job of explaining it, but hopefully this demonstration shows you how to make your own Gothic arch. Once I've drawn a Gothic arch onto a piece of foam board, I cut it out with my utility knife. As you can see, I chose to make the window as large as possible, extending almost to the top of the piece. I cut a beveled edge on one side, and then cut out the window. With the test fit in, you can see it's starting to go the direction we want. Using my compass, I trace out a slightly larger Gothic arch than the one that I made previously. This is going to allow me to make some decorative pieces by layering on top of the arch that I've already established. decided that first one was a little bit too big, so I made a smaller Gothic arch inside it. Using a ruler, I extended the lines downward to the base to make sure everything lined up nicely. Then very carefully with my X-Acto knife, I cut that piece out as well. Laid out on top of the arch I made from foam board, these pieces add some depth and detail. Next, I measure a 1-inch square off the bottom of each one and cut them to length. This is going to be so they overlap the 1-inch foam of the ground and create a more 3D effect. Next, using a ruler and a piece of paper, I cut a shape that also matches the Gothic arch shape and trace that on a piece of foam board. Cutting out that shape, I duplicate it, and using these two shapes, I add some more depth and detail to the piece, gluing it on with white glue. Using some super glue and the tip of an X-Acto knife, I apply some nail art beads to give the impression of rivets. These remind us that we are in fact in the belly of a massive ship, a huge construction of steel at a titanic scale. I cut out a piece that will be the adjacent bulkhead wall, again cutting a bevel into it with a sharp X-Acto knife. Next, using some strips of card, I glue them to the inside of the arch to give the arch some depth and a smooth interior finish, hiding the foam from the foam board. This is a tea light that I bought on Amazon. I'll put a link in the description for these. They're really bright, nice tea lights, and a huge box of them was pretty cheap. I tried to cut into them. They're very hard to get into, but I soon figured out that there's a really easy way to do it. If you take something sharp, in this case the tip of my compass, you can pop them out no problem. And you get this bright LED with a switch on it. It's pretty versatile. Next, using some drywall filler, I smooth the edges of my piece, trying to hide the pieces of foam that haven't been covered in the previous step. In addition, I add some into the edges on the outside of the arch, filling it in and smoothing it to get a more varied shape that looks less like pieces of card glued together. I cut a backing piece for the arch on the left, cutting it to length with some scissors. And then using an X-Acto knife, I cut a small square, a rectangle, whatever. Next, I'm going to use some tiny pieces of cereal cardstock. This is a card you get from a cereal box. This one's Cinnamon Toast Crunch, in case you guys are wondering. Any cereal box will work. I use these strips to line the edge of the opening, just to give it a little bit more detail. Like that. Next, I glue on a piece of mesh from the back side. This mesh is Sculptor's Mesh. I'll put a link in the description for that as well. I want to give the impression of wires and pipes running in behind the facade here. So to do that, I cut two thin lengths of styrene tubing and take a length of wire, bending it so that there's multiple wire segments visible. Then using some hot glue, I'm going to glue these elements into place so they'll be just barely visible through that mesh hole, and you'll get a nice extra sense of detail. In the final product, this is barely noticeable, but if you do see it, it adds some depth to the scene that I think is worth it. This is really giving the impression that this is a working ship, and that there are cables and pipes and all sorts of goings on in behind this metal bulkheads. Next, I use a piece of I-beam that I made from chipboard for a previous project, and I cut that to length. I made some more of these shapes that went on the earlier facade, gluing them together. And then I glue my backing piece into the piece itself, using some hot glue. Using the tip of my knife, I gouge out a hole and add a small magnet. This is going to allow me to put some different details above the arch, depending on what kind of ship I want this to be. I glue in my beam, and I glue in my shapes, suggesting a ribbing that goes towards an arched ceiling. Next, I use some more pieces of chipboard that I cut for a previous project and came in handy for this one. And I made some nice mechanical looking supports. I detailed this piece same as before. You could say this part is riveting. I'll see myself out. The next step, I cover the project in Mod Podge. This will seal the paper elements and seal the foam element, adding some durability, rigidity, and protection from aerosol spray paints. I used some bits from my bits box, in this case an Imperial Aquila and a Chaos symbol, and glue them to magnets, making sure to get the polarity right so they can be attached to the project. Boom, just like that you can make it a Chaos ship or an Imperial ship that you're looking out of. And as is fitting, because of the polarity of the magnets, the Imperium and the Chaos repel each other as opposites. Next, I spray the whole project with some Krylon black spray paint. And then from above, I do a light dusting of silver spray paint. Making sure to leave some of the black in the dark recesses. I used a black piece of paper, spray painted, and then stabbed with a compass for my night sky. As you can see, light coming through those little holes looks a little bit like stars. Fold the paper, stuff it in the back there, making sure it fits in a way that the curve of the paper hides the structure itself. Using the tip of an X-Acto knife, I drill some holes in the back and just pop the LED candles right in there. It doesn't look pretty from the back, but this piece is meant to be viewed from the front. And the idea is, if these things ever run out of batteries, I can just swap them out easily. And as you can see, it makes a decent nice night sky effect. I add a piece of paper in behind the black piece of paper just to diffuse the light a little bit. This one, I'm painting black onto the LED itself because it focuses the beam and creates a bit of a spotlight effect. Using a piece of chipboard, I add a base to the project. Cutting it out with some scissors and gluing it on with some hot glue. I trim the edges with a sharp bladed X-Acto knife. Next, I dry brush the project with bolt gun metal. And with that done, I apply some Nuln Oil. Nuln Oil is a wash made by Games Workshop. It's fairly expensive to use on larger projects like terrain, but this thing doesn't have that much surface area, so I figured it was worth it. I decided to do the floor in a marble pattern. So using Incubi Darkness, I used a small sponge and dabbed on color onto the floor, adding successively small amounts of white to lighten the mixture, sponging on a random pattern, eventually moving to almost pure white. Then with a fine paintbrush, I came in and added some veining to the marble with some small squiggly lines. Initially it reminded me a little bit of lightning, but with a little bit of work, adding crisscrossing lines, I got an effect I was really pleased with. This cold, smooth floor I think will really accentuate the way the piece feels in the end. Using some black, I touched up the edge. Using my compass, I drilled a hole from the front to the back so I could mount the little ship with a hidden suspension that gives the impression that it's floating in space. Using the tip of my knife, I drilled in a hole and then fed through a small steel rail. This is from a railway kit, but I used it because it's a rigid piece that'll be great for holding up a Battlefleet Gothic ship. Then I hot glued a magnet to the rail and hot glued magnets to the ships as well. And then into the side I drilled a hole, adding another LED. This one will act as a spotlight to illuminate the ship. As you can see, I burnt my piece with my glue gun. I'm going to have to patch that up and paint over it later. No big deal, stuff like this happens. I painted up some Battlefleet Gothic ships, one in the midnight clad of the Night Lords, and the other in the blood red of the Blood Angels. These two factions are enemies, and I happen to collect both of them. This will add some variation to my diorama by adding switchable elements. These Battlefleet Gothic ships have a ton of detail, and they're pretty quick and easy to paint up. I had a lot of fun with this. I painted the Imperial Aquila and the Chaos symbol, added some gold trim to my ships, the last step is just to use the magnetized ship and attach it into the backdrop. Let's turn on the lights and see how it looks.